Politics Show with Bernard Ponsonby.
Hello, good morning and a warm welcome to the Go Radio Politics Show. On today's programme, the Scottish Labour leader Anas Sarwar called for change in Downing Street this week in an extraordinary intervention aimed at rescuing his ambitions to become First Minister. Courageous or foolhardy, we discuss the move. Scotland is in the grip of a housing crisis, but how do we solve it? I'll ask party representatives what they plan to do about it. And does the justice system really work for victims? This week, the Scottish Tory leader raised the issue in Parliament. It appears criminals are being released not out of any sense of justice, but because our jail capacity is too small. Well, that's all ahead in the next hour in the company of my two guests this morning, who are Alison Thewlis, the former SNP MP for Glasgow Central, who will contest the Holyrood seat of the same name in May, and Paul Sweeney of Scottish Labour, a current MSP who is looking to represent the people of Springburn and Easterhouse in May. Well, on Monday, Anas Sarwar called on the Prime Minister to quit. By the day's end, the Prime Minister was emboldened and Mr Sarwar looked weak. The domino effect he hoped for with his dramatic intervention did not work. The consensus in the Westminster lobby is that others who had privately pledged to follow suit bottled it. So we now have the situation where on the eve of a Scottish election, the Scottish Labour leader has no confidence in the man who is a Labour Prime Minister. Now, there are two obvious questions that jump out here. One, what on earth was he thinking? And two, and this is my first question for my guest, what was the calculation here? Paul?
Well, I think I was as surprised as anyone at the intervention on Monday. I actually happened to be in the UK Parliament for a series of meetings, so I was on the ground, if you like, when it broke. And everyone seemed quite bewildered by it. It certainly wasn't something I expected. But, you know, he said everything that everyone's saying in private, that the writing's on the wall for the Prime Minister. It's not something we relish saying, but I think the canvassing that we are doing is self-evident. And unlike others, we don't have the luxury of time. We have 81 days to the Scottish elections. And whilst others might have priced in our defeat, we don't want to simply capitulate to that inevitability. We want to strike out and do what we can to improve our position as best we can over the next few days. And I think Anas's calculation wasn't done in concert with the allies, despite the speculation. I'm fairly confident he came to the decision himself because even people very close to Anas weren't aware of it.
You say you're very confident. The bottom line is that you don't know, because I'm assuming that the Labour group at Holyrood, and these are the foot soldiers who are going to be standing for election in May, weren't consulted.
We weren't aware of it in advance. It was Anas's decision. But nonetheless, it was a decision that we've all privately probably wanted them to do for a while and been somewhat impatient about it. So I think it's been frustrating, for sure. But we are where we are. And I think it's certainly the case that Anas is his own man. And he'll be going into this election aiming to lead the country. And I think when you see today's poll, for example, most Scots are backing Anas's decision. And when you're canvassing, you know, every other conversation turns to the unpopularity of the Prime Minister.
Okay, I'm going to come back to the and tease out further the calculation and whether or not this gamble will actually work. Now, Alison, I suppose you should be grinning from ear to ear. So I want you to put your SNP loyalties to aside for one moment. Given where Labour are in the polls, and the polls are predicting that they will be third, I think one poll in terms of the electoral calculus has them falling as low as 15 seats, which would be far the worst result in the devolved era. Desperate times call for courageous measures.
I think this is absolutely astonishing as a move. I mean, for the Labour Party, who waited so long to get into power at Westminster, to have fallen apart in 18 months in the way that they have is just absolutely astonishing. They said, you know, Keir Starmer is the man, he's the guy who's going to deliver change, he's, the great hope for a new Britain, all this kind of stuff. and then they're trying to get rid of him 18 months in. It's absolutely astonishing. And as a political calculation, telling people in Scotland when you're running into 80 odd days to an election that you have no confidence in the Prime Minister you helped get elected 18 months ago, again, absolutely astonishing. And Paul talked about the poll that said that most Scots are backing Annis's position. I mean, what that tells you is that most Scots don't like Keir Starmer either, which again, not the great ringing endorsement of the Labour Party ahead of a campaign.
Well, let me just play devil's advocate with us just a second, and I think there's an element. I'm not just asking this to play devil's advocate. These kind of stories about leaderships and internal party debates, as you know, they excite the lobby at Westminster, they excite the lobby at Holyrood. Political activists and journalists can't stop talking about them. But those of us who talk about these things live in a bubble.
Absolutely.
The people out there who are going to be electing a government in May do not live in a bubble. And I'm going to put it to you, to a certain extent, I could come up with lots of reasons why this is crackers, and it makes a lot of people within the bubble think it's crackers, but people out there I don't think are as concerned about this as people in the bubble are.
Certainly. And they're not getting into the detail of who did what and plots and everything else and the whole kind of soap opera drama of it that we're into. What they're looking at it and seeing is chaos and a party that's not talking to their interests. There's families struggling with the cost of living crisis. There's families struggling with their energy bills. None of this drama is dealing with any of that. It's not dealing with those concerns. And even Anas in his remarks that he made on Monday was not talking about Epstein's victims, which should be at the core of what is bringing the Prime Minister down here about appointing.
I don't think he actually mentioned Starmer by name.
No. So none of this deals with the actual bread and butter issues that folk are struggling with right now. So what people look at that and they say, that's a party that cares about itself and its own little dramas. They don't care about us.
OK, we'll come on in a minute to talk about what may well dominate the election once it gets underway. But Paul, let me just sort of put this to you. If a Labour strategist had said to me, let me run something past you, Bernard, and Anas is going to call for the Prime Minister to resign, what do you think? I would say, it's crackers. It's mad. And here's why it's mad. First of all, he has limited leverage in relation to the Prime Minister. So Anas Sarwar cannot remove the Prime Minister. And there's no point in calling for something which is not in your gift and your power to deliver. But secondly, even if you are in concert with others and you do manage to have this domino effect which leads to the resignation of the Prime Minister, you're then into a Labour leadership election, which is going to be the backdrop to the Scottish election. And when you get leadership elections within parties, people sometimes manufacture differences with other candidates, and therefore the backstory will be a party divided. And the bottom line is that parties who are perceived by the voters out there to be divided don't win elections, and divided parties isn't a bubble story.
It's certainly a gamble, and as they say, the difference between genius and insanity is measured only by success. So I suppose we will find out in 81 days' time whether it was a good calculation or not. I don't think it's without risk, as you've highlighted. However, the conversation will inevitably turn throughout this campaign to the question of Starmer's confidence in the Prime Minister. So in a way, he's answered that question to discharge the issue and allow the debate to move on to the substantive question of what should the government of Scotland be and what should the government of Scotland look like and why Anas is the best candidate for First Minister. So I think in a way, by preempting the inevitable discussion throughout the campaign, he's allowed that to at least be cauterised to some extent, and then the debate can move on. So I can understand the logic in his decision, though I wasn't privy to it.
Well, Alison, I mean, to what extent will this be a big issue in the election campaign? I take it then when we get to the leaders' debates, and just before we come on air, you were talking about sometimes when you're doing canvassing how things that happen in leaders' debates, you get back on the doorstep the next day. So when Anas Sarwar is saying, vote for me because the SNP government's record on a whole series of issues is appalling, what the country needs is change, John Swinney just needs to look at him and say, yeah, we all voted for change about 2 years ago, and the change has resulted in a Labour leader, a Scottish Labour leader, having no confidence in the Prime Minister. That's some change. I mean,
Yeah, and that is the question that will be put now through the rest of the duration of this campaign, because he's basically said, I have no confidence in the Prime Minister. It's an act of disloyalty as well in anything else. And where are we not heading into the Scottish election campaign in the way that we are? Keir Starmer would be within his rights to sack him in the way that Richard Leonard was got rid of ahead of the 2021 campaign. Because how can you say that you're one party working together when your leader in Scotland is saying you're no good?
Let me put another point to you, Paul, which is this. That strategy, which I understand where Anas Sarwar is coming from, and I understand that in desperate times, sometimes desperate measures are demanded. But here's the issue. I think privately, anyone within Scottish Labour who thinks they're going to win this election and that Anas Sarwar can become First Minister really doesn't understand just where the party is. That rather than getting rid of the Prime Minister, from the point of view of emboldening Labour's electoral position in Scotland, it would have been far better had they had a coherent attack plan against Reform UK, because it's Reform UK that is acting as the brake on Labour's progress, not so much actually the SNP, whose vote, according to the polls, is well down compared to 2021.
Yeah, well, there is a significant change in the dynamics of Scottish politics with Reform UK's position. Even though the SNP's popular share of the vote in the current polling is down from about 48% to around 35%, you're seeing a significant displacement of other parties. So this fragmentation is producing a sort of probably what would be the most disproportionate results in the Scottish Parliament's history. So it is a difficult position. But one thing that has been clear is, if you look at the 2024 Labour vote, it's gone largely from Labour committed to undecided, and it's there to be won back in the right circumstances. So I think Anas's calculation is he can win back the confidence of those people who have gone from Labour in 2024 to undecided and rally his position and Labour's position in the next few weeks. And I think we can certainly do that.
I don't look at, political parties conduct their own private polling, they conduct their own focus groups, and I don't doubt for a moment what you've just said there is what your polling shows. But given the polling numbers for Reform UK, this has to be more than just a collapse in support for the Scottish Conservatives, who are still polling around the sort of 12-13% mark anyway. There must be people who voted Labour in 2024 on the change message who are considering voting for Reform.
Yeah.
Now,
and Reform voters really don't like Keir Starmer. So in that way, it certainly cauterised that concern. And also the question will turn to, who are the candidates for First Minister? I think it's clear that the Reform leader is not a serious candidate for First Minister. The only real contender in the ring is Anas.
Sure, but again, just following this line of argument through, that Anas Sarwar would have been far better training his guns on Reform than training his guns on Keir Starmer, in the sense there's nothing he can do. He has no leverage to remove Keir Starmer. But if you had a coherent line with Reform, and perhaps pointed out to many people who had voted Labour in the past, the political nature of the Reform exercise, out with all the stuff on immigration, and had a coherent line against Reform on left-right politics, that might stop the hemorrhaging. That strategy, to me, would have made sense.
It's not a mutually exclusive one. I think there's much opportunity to do that through this campaign, and certainly it was something that was done effectively during the Hamilton by-election, where despite all the hype around Reform, they ended up coming third. So I think you'll see a lot of very hotly contested
25% of the vote from nothing.
Oh,
nothing
absolutely.
to 25%.
Absolutely,
and the problem is that Reform, they don't need to be polling 25%. I said elsewhere this week on a podcast that if Reform were really concerned about the union, if they were really concerned about the union, they would just stand on the list and at least give Labour and the Conservatives the opportunity to dent what looks like a landslide for the SNP on the first past the post system. But they're not.
Well, the dynamics of the Central Belt, I think, will be very hotly contested marginal constituencies. So I think there'll be a great degree of unpredictability in the election coming up. And I think that will only tighten as we get into the short campaign.
Okay, well, let's sort of move on from the Labour issue, because Alison, it does, and Paul pointed on this in one of his earlier answers, it does look as if this will be the most disproportionate result of the devolved era, if the polls are to be believed, and we have all the health warnings that quite a lot can change in a short period of time. But it looks as if the SNP vote is certainly going to be down over 10 percentage points, maybe as much as 15, depending on which polls you happen to read. Isn't the reality is that whoever wins this election, it'll be a case of they're not very popular, but people will go, well, I'm not particularly enthused by them, but they're better than the other lot.
I think we'll wait and see what the result will be. We're certainly working very hard to rebuild the trust of voters who may not have voted for us in 2024. And we're working hard to make sure that the polls, what they're showing just now, is not going to be what the finished result is. We're working really, really hard to make that happen under John Swinney's leadership. But the concern is real in terms of the wider cynicism about politics, about people who are not just going to turn out at all in this election. And that is for all of us in politics to be concerned about, because we want people to turn out and vote. We want people to participate in our democracy. And what I perceive, over many years, it's not due to one party or another. It's parties that promise big and then don't deliver. And people are fed up with that. People don't believe when somebody says that they're going to do a thing that it's going to happen. And I think that's quite a concerning thing, and people are switching off because of that. Some of that is to do with the way that things are presented in the media. Some of that is to do with politicians ourselves. Some of that's just to do with wider issues in society, that things are more complicated, more difficult, you've got the impact of Brexit that's touching everything, but we don't really see it in that same way in terms of the cost of living, for example. These are complex things, and we can't turn that around in a simple way. We need to work with people to try and to bring them out, to get them to vote, to get them to participate. We need to deliver on our promises to do that. But there is that wider cynicism about politics, which is feeding into some of that reform vote as well. People who have tried a whole bunch of parties and then go, well, I might as well vote for them because there's what's going to happen. So it's a worrying thing. It's a worrying trend, and we need to be aware of that.
Paul, I suppose that if you can keep the election on the record of the government, and that's the issue, that is the determining issue, you might get some traction, but there'll be a whole lot of noise around independence mandates, and there'll be a whole lot of noise around Keir Starmer. And in a sense, voters have got the right to make their decision based upon what agenda matters to them. But from your point of view, trying to pin the record of the government on things like public services and economic growth must be the obvious line of attack for you.
Well, absolutely, particularly because the current government, the Scottish National Party-led government, has been in power since I was in school. So it is an unprecedented length of time in power, impressive indeed. But I think there is a law of diminishing returns that inevitably meets every government. And indeed, there's no great love or enthusiasm out there for the incumbent government, which has been beset by its own catalogue of problems, as we've seen just this week with the kind of Scottish Ceausescu story kind of emerging. So I think with the scandals that have engulfed the Scottish government in recent years, there has been a genuine erosion of trust generally in politics. And I think that's, as Alison hinted at, down to a number of different concerns. Also, the fact that the capacity of the state institutionally to do things it used to be able to do has been eroded significantly over the last 50 years or so. And how do we actually address those questions that are very complex? I know we're going to go on to talk about some of those practical challenges in a moment, but housing just one of the issues that is constantly an issue in Glasgow for me, and certainly my casework, and a product of deep frustration and a deep sense of people's well-being being affected by it.
But it is remarkable, utterly remarkable, that you have a party which has been in power since 2007. And the former Labour Prime Minister, Jim Callaghan, in 79, when he was looking back on the election of Margaret Thatcher on the 1st of May 79, says that, every once in a while, irrespective of what you do or what your record looks like, time for a change becomes a prevalent mood. Now, I suppose that time for a change was what helped turbocharge a landslide for Keir Starmer, and 35% of the vote. But it is truly remarkable that after this length of time, that an incumbent party is still on course to win 60 seats. What does that say about the effectiveness of the opposition parties in Parliament?
I don't think it's so much a question about the effectiveness of opposition parties. Obviously, the change in the further fragmentation of the political party landscape in Scotland is one issue, but also what has driven Scottish politics for the last decade or so has been the constitutional question, and people are still, associating their position on that with their loyalties to particular political parties. So that creates a stickier sense of loyalty, I think, to the SNP than you might otherwise get. So you do get people who will quite openly say, I can't stand the SNP in various ways, but they're the vehicle to independence, so I'll continue to vote for them regardless. Or you'll get people who are actually just angry at the world and will be like, I used to vote SNP, I'm voting Reform. So you get people going off in lots of different directions.
You also get people that are quite content with the SNP and happy with their record as well, I should say.
I'm sure you are very much an adherent to that position, but and undoubtedly, like, you have all party loyalists or tribalists to some extent.
We remain a popular party. That is the case.
Well, the least unpopular.
The least unpopular, I think. For the purposes of this election, I think least unpopular. But if we're looking at it going back over a number of years, it's very difficult to argue with the proposition. I mean, former Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson used to say that it was his ambition to make Labour the natural party of government. I mean, the SNP are the natural party of government in Scotland because they've been in for 19 years. And I think even the most ardent SNP supporter privately would concede there's quite a lot that's gone wrong. And yet, when a lot goes wrong, they are still in pole position to win, Alison.
Yes. But I think, as I was saying, that kind of underlying argument is still that lots of things have also gone right. And people do see the difference in their life. They have seen things that have made a real difference. Now, whether that's being able to access free prescriptions, which, in England, you don't get. It's just an entirely different thing in Scotland.
Well, 90% of prescriptions were free before the SNP came to power.
But you have that administration, that cost of things, and it becomes a barrier to people accessing that. It becomes a tax on ill health, which is why we brought that in. And I don't know whether Paul's proposing to remove prescriptions on that basis.
I just think it's important the nuance is not lost, because if you go from 90% free to 100% free, it's not quite the same as 0 to 100. And I think. But
it was a barrier on ill health. It was very clear that was the case. So people have got things like that they see. Their children are able to go to university without coming out with the eye-watering levels of debt that they would do in England. That's an opportunity that you get in Scotland that you simply don't get in England.
But you do have to take out a loan for living costs, though.
But you're not coming out with the student loans scandal that was just reported on in this past week about the amount of interest people are having to pay on those student loans in England that they will impossible ever to pay off. So people are seeing the benefit of these things in their daily lives. They might not be thinking about them every day when they go and pick up a prescription or when their kids go off to uni, but it's there.
One of the big issues, which you both know well about, because when you were an MP, your mailbag would have been full of it. Paul deals with a lot of it, is housing. Yes. We're going to come on to talk about the politics of housing, what these two parties will have to offer the voters in May. We'll be back with that after the short commercial.
Politics Show with Bernard Ponsonby.
And welcome back. In the run-up to the Holyrood elections, we are going to examine some of the big issues that are likely to feature in the campaign. Today, we start with Scotland's housing crisis. Here are a few facts and figures that capture the nature of it. There are almost 200,000 households in Scotland waiting for housing or relocations. New build housing doesn't meet demand. When it comes to affordable homes, the number of starts and completions is falling. The Scottish Government has to deliver 80,000 new homes by 2032 to meet their own targets. No one in the housing sector believes they will get close to this figure. And then there is the vulnerable. Rough sleeping is up. Households assessed as homeless up. Households in temporary accommodation up. The number of children living in temporary accommodation also up. All of this after 27 years of devolution. These facts and figures really ought to shame. Alison, what's gone wrong?
I think nobody would argue that there isn't an issue with housing. That is very, very clear. But I think what's important here actually is to understand a bit more of the context around this. I mean, over the past number of years, we've had a number of crises that have added to the cost of building housing. So you had Brexit, you had inflation, you had the war in Ukraine. All of those are added massively to the cost of construction in the UK. So it's that kind of context. So you can build fewer houses now than you could previously with the same amount of money, say. So in order to meet some of that challenge, the new Scottish Government budget that's being in the process of being approved puts 4.9 billion over the next 4 years into housing in Scotland. That's a significant amount of money. It is going into the affordable housing supply, and that will begin to make a dent on those issues. But as you were saying, casework that I had was very heavy on housing.
But let me put you. I mean, I get the point that you've made about Brexit, Ukraine, all this kind of stuff. I'm not saying that it's not a factor. What I was saying in that intro is that we're 27 years into devolution, and one of the arguments for having a devolved parliament is that the politicians in Scotland were going to get on top of an issue, and you've been in power a long time, but we also had Labour and Liberal executives as well. And these problems have been getting progressively worse, irrespective of who's in power. I mean, you gave that figure of almost 5 billion. Let me put maybe a much more instructive figure. 1 year, the SNP government cut the housing budget by 200 million and then reinstated it by, I think, 196 the following year in the budget, because the approach of successive cabinet secretaries is to deal with whatever the perceived problem is this year. So we have to give more to local government, so we're not giving it to housing, or we're giving it to housing, so we have to take it from enterprise. And those in the housing sector who are on the sharp end of all of this just despair, because there's a sticking plaster solution to what is, according to one former Conservative housing minister in England, and I think he's right, the greatest issue of social justice in this country today is the inability of ordinary people to access decent homes.
And I think that is, he's quite correct in what he says there, but I think the wider context again of this is the uncertainty in the Scottish Government's capital budget. So we don't control all of that. We have budgets that are set by Westminster, and we had a great degree of uncertainty over the past decade of how much exactly would come in that budget. So you can't, the Scottish Government itself can't plan on that basis that it will have that.
But you can't, I mean, politics is the language of priorities and the language of choice. There is no country in the world with a magic money tree that can fund absolutely everything that there is almost an infinite demand for. So at the end of the day, this comes down to hard choices. And here's the reality. Here is absolutely the reality. Housing has not been your priority.
Housing has been a priority. We built significantly more housing in Scotland.
How can we have these statistics if it was a priority?
Because those pressures are happening at the same time. We are building houses. If you walk out of the front door of this building, you will see brand new social rented housing down the street in Lauriston. You will see new housing that's been built over the past couple of years in the Gorbals.
It barely scratches the surface. You know this. It barely scratches the surface.
In that context of a budget that we can't be certain of, we are delivering a huge amount of social rented housing, proportionately more in Glasgow than in Manchester or Liverpool and in other cities. We are building more of that.
Paul Sweeney, this was also a factor on your watch as well.
It's a breathtaking decision, in my view, probably the worst of this Parliament amongst many, to cut the social housing supply budget by a quarter in 1 year, which has led to a corresponding collapse in social housing completions in the face of a housing emergency. Certainly the government recognised the folly of that and reversed it, but the problem is you've then wiped out a year of construction programmes, which then take another few years to mobilise again. And of course, with rising construction costs, further damages the viability of projects. So across Glasgow housing associations have been saying that they had programmes to deliver which have been stalled due to this situation. Also, what you've had is a number of other problems that have militated against what James Mitchell would describe as a wicked problem. So, for example, a 5-year standoff over rent controls. So whilst I support rent controls, the devil is always in the detail. And the thing that people came back time and time again was saying the lack of definition of what it means. Is it retail price inflation +5? What is the rent control limit? And the very nature of the uncertainty meant that all the investment in new house building from the private sector was going into Manchester, Leeds, Liverpool, not into Glasgow. And that further compounded the supply issues in the city. And then also you have issues around the failure of us to reform, or the failure of the government to reform the pension funds, the public sector pension funds in Scotland. So, for example, the Strathclyde Pension Fund could be reformed in a similar way to Manchester's, which would allow us to leverage investment into the city and do more property development in-house. And I know Alison's involved with Clyde Gateway, and that's a good example of how you can supercharge public investment and leverage in that private investment. So simply relying year to year on budgetary changes is unnecessary. John Wheatley wrote about this a century ago. He talked about the idea of municipal banks, the idea of you reinvesting the surpluses from the tramway system in Glasgow into house building for workers. There's ways to do this intelligently and stably and with a long-term pipeline. But we have failed really to address it with the elegance and sophistication that we ought to have.
One of the other issues, and Labour made a lot of noise of this south of the border, is the planning system. And I was chairing a housing conference last year, and there were a number of housing people that run building companies. And one of them said to the audience that day, I've just had it with Glasgow. I've absolutely had it with Glasgow, because trying to get planning permission out of Glasgow City Council is torture when compared to local authorities south of the border.
This is another interesting point, because Glasgow City Council has lost a lot of its planning capacity, a combination of cuts to local authorities where the cities had to prioritise social care, social work and schools at the expense of other services, but also because there's a really competitive market for planners out there. So, for example, a lot of people have left to go and work for Scottish Power building renewable energy projects. But also, the planning system is inherently subjective. It's not place-based, it's not plot-based. So, for example, if you take a scheme out there like Lauriston, all of it has to be individually consented in little packages. You can't just design a whole master plan for a district and just build it out over a 10-year period. You have to go back time and time again to approve it in increments. And you have practically planning officers picking the curtains. You can't just pre-approve a catalogue of common designs which you can build out. So I think we need to massively streamline it. I've had people come to me saying they've been waiting 14 months for planning consents, and then when they finally get the consent, the viability of the project's being held under the waterline by inflation. You get that quite commonly in Glasgow. So I think there's a myriad of issues there. But again, I think the government hasn't addressed it with the level of urgency and rigour that really ought to have happened. And as a result, you've got thousands of people who are sleeping, in temporary accommodation. It's rising costs for the city because having to pay all these hotel costs. And also just generally terrible for well-being, particularly for kids. We've got a scandalously high level of children in temporary accommodation, and it has a lifelong impact, having that level of insecurity in childhood.
Alison, is there a specific problem with planning in Glasgow?
It's certainly something that has been raised with me as well. It's issues about capacity within the system, and I think anything more that can be done to improve that, to get more planners working, I think would be very welcome. I think the wider context in some of this as well is that Glasgow City Council can't build its own homes. It was part of the deal that set up housing stock transfer, where Glasgow City Council is no longer allowed to build its own homes. So it is reliant upon the housing associations of the city, who do a good job to make that work. So the Scottish Government will give money to the council, that will then be dispersed through the housing plan to those housing associations to do that. And I think allowing the council to do those kinds of things on its own might be part of a solution to do that. We've also, the Scottish Government have brought about More Homes Scotland, which will be a national agency which can then get in and do that, perhaps where there isn't that local capacity, because some of those smaller housing associations just don't have the development capacity to build large new schemes to get them through planning, and that's a bit of a jam in the system as well. Let me
pick up a point that Paul made, and I think he referenced Manchester on this, and the issue of pension funds. I mean, wearing another hat a long time ago, I used to be a trustee of a pension fund, which controlled, I think it was nearly £400 million worth of assets. And the investment managers would go and invest in things like the multi-storey car park off the high street. And I used to always think, well, why can't we do something which is more socially useful and invest in housing? And I know that this was a big thing for Labour in Manchester to do, and with some degree of success, levering in money from private pension funds, which gets round the fact that all governments effectively are limited in terms of the amount of resources that they have. Shouldn't, specifically with the Strathclyde Pension Fund, which I think is comfortably the biggest in Scotland.
30 billion, I believe, of assets.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of money that and the kind of people that run this, I would have thought, would have been pretty sympathetic to investing in housing.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree. And we need to look at those innovative solutions about what we can do that will work. And I know that I think Canadian pension funds invest in Scotland. So I think
the airport.
Yeah. So I think there's why can we not do these things ourselves? I think that's absolutely worthwhile. And as Paul mentioned, some of the Clyde Gateway investments have come through pension funds, both public and private pension funds, to create buildings and jobs in the East End of Glasgow. So there are solutions there, but we need to match up that investment with those projects. And for some of the pension funds, the housing projects that are proposed are too small, really, for them to do that investment. Yes. It needs to be of significant size for the investment to work for them. If you want to build 20 houses, that's simply not enough.
Absolutely. Let me be sort of provocative with both of you, because when you look at the statistics about the number of people who want a tenancy or want a relocation, and you look at the number of houses that are being built either for social rent or mid-market rent, I come back to my point. It sort of scratches the surface. And you're an elected representative. You were an elected representative and hope to be an elected representative after May. If a single person turns up to your constituency and says, I've been on the waiting list of the following housing associations for 10 years, I'm 34 years of age, and I'm still living with my parents. If you were being absolutely honest with them, you would just tell them, you've never got any chance of a tenancy. It's never going to happen. Put it out your mind, because that's the reality.
Well, for a lot of the houses that are being built are not being built for single people as well. Lots of those are 2-bedroom and bigger, because the pressure is for those larger families. We want to try and get them into housing. Where there are slight alternatives to that is through organisations like Homes for Good, who are a kind of far more morally ethical private sector rented accommodation provider. So they work with private landlords. They do things in a much better way. So perhaps there are more chances through models like that where there perhaps isn't for social
The point
rental.
that I make in the post-war period, and here's the thing, because clearly after something like a war, the need for housing was absolutely key and fundamental. And I simply cannot get my head round. I cannot get my head round why, at a period after the war, when you were talking hundreds, if not millions of people had to be housed, and under the two Harolds, Macmillan and Wilson, one Conservative, one Labour, what it demonstrated is that if there was the political will to do it, then we'll do it. And I think one of the problems in, dare I say, a more prosperous time for other people is that politicians take their eye off the ball, because what people are concerned about is, when am I going to get my foot on the housing ladder? And the people who don't have the money to buy have been left behind in the last 30 or 40 years. And it goes all the way back to the right to buy under Mrs. Thatcher in the early 80s. And the whole, I mean, social housing used to be, it was a passion
Well,
of
half
people in the
half
life.
of Scotland in the 1970s lived in council housing. It was the high share out of any economy in the world, apart from the Soviet
I'm
bloc.
not saying that that was a good thing. I'm just making the point that if there's a social need, it's the responsibility of politicians to plug it.
Absolutely. And there's good and innovative examples out there. You mentioned the challenge of single young people trying to access housing. Lar Housing Trust is an interesting example, which I've been to see. It's chaired by Ken McIntosh, the former presiding officer. And they have an interesting model, which is patient loans. So they're trying to get bank finance, but also government loans. And one of the problems is the structure set up to provide grants, not loans. But they don't need the grant. They just need some patient loans. They can go out and buy the buildings. They're actually looking at retrofitting buildings. So they bought an old paint factory up in Rockhill and have renovated it very successfully into flats primarily for mature students. But there's also a myriad of other buildings around Glasgow. They're looking to do the Inn on the Green just by Bridgeton and a few other projects, but they can't get the loan finance because the government won't be flexible enough with them. So it's an obvious tantalising example of how you can unlock investment very quickly with a bit of ingenuity and a bit of innovation. And if there was a bit more agility in St Andrews House, the Scottish Government headquarters, they could do something to unlock more capacity quite quickly.
How depressing is it if you're holding a surgery? Is it when you get perhaps a mum and a dad with a couple of kids coming in? Because if you don't have appropriate housing, and the housing that you're in is affecting the health of your child, and you feel powerless to help that child, and that has an impact on your mental health, and collectively it injects a sense of helplessness and misery in the family, and all elected representatives want to do their best for folk, but they can only do their best with what's available. And it comes back to that. I mean, I'd hate to do your job, because I really would hate to, in a sense, even as an elected representative, feel powerless to transform this when this need is sat across a table from you.
Well, you take those cases on. I will, and Paul will, and any other elected representative will do. And you advocate on their behalf, because there's always the chance that their case hasn't been fully addressed by a housing association, that the need isn't understood, that maybe there's disabilities there that haven't been taken into account. And you can go to those different housing associations around the city and make that case, and you can work with them for that. But yeah, for some people, I have had cases where I've literally had to wait for a house to be built for somebody before they could move out. You know, it's a family with 2 babies, 2 older teenagers in a 2-bedroom flat. And you're having to wait for that larger house to be built. And it's hugely frustrating for them. And for those families at the heart of that, very, very hard. Very, very hard for their mental health and the ability of the kids to study and the impact on one another. It's difficult.
One of the things that does my head in Glasgow is the lack of a common housing register, which I've raised with ministers before, and there has been a bit of a Mexican standoff between housing associations and the government and council about getting this sorted, where you just have a single point of application and then a clearinghouse sits behind that to find the relevant accommodation in the city for someone and at least offer them that single interface. Right now, MPs, MSPs are sending 20 different letters to different housing associations seeking a home for someone. It's crazily inefficient. I support community-based housing associations and that idea of accountability at a local community level, but there's definitely a way to join it up at a citywide level to allow at least people to apply once and then they can sort it out later on. I think that's something that quite quickly we could fix, but it's just been kind of left as in the too difficult to sort out pile, but with a bit of leadership.
Difficult to get everybody to agree to it, isn't it?
Yeah, so you need the minister to kind of crack the whip and get everyone around the table and sort it out,
Okay, well, that was housing. We're going to be back in part 3. We're going to be taking a look at the justice system. That's after this commercial break.
Is the Go Radio Politics Show with Bernard Ponsonby.
And welcome back. This week at Holyrood, the Scottish Conservative leader Russell Finlay raised the case of Keith Rawlinson, a 58-year-old bus driver who died of a heart attack following an attack by a teenager on his bus. The attacker, a boy of 15 at the time, was originally charged with murder, but admitted to the lesser charge of culpable homicide. He was sentenced to just 4 years and 4 months in custody and could be released soon under early release measures championed by the current government. Sentencing guidelines are established by the Independent Sentencing Council, but politicians can intervene if they so choose. Mr. Rawlinson's killer will also be free to use his free bus pass on his release, something the Conservatives deplored in Parliament. So my question, is our justice system, as the Conservatives allege, a soft touch? Paul?
I think there's genuine outrage in Elgin from people I've spoke to who live there about this situation, and we can't simply close our eyes and ears to that situation of a lack of accountability, lack of justice for this family who've suffered the most appalling tragedy, heartbreaking, and then to feel it, the memory of their loved one has been besmirched by the paucity of the sentence. I think there is a concern that there's been a general decriminalisation of people under the age of 16 without the commensurate support services, prevention, accountability that's required in this country. A recent example was in Kilmarnock, actually. I was speaking to a councillor. It was a building in the town centre was set on fire by young teenagers. And he was saying people are voting reform. They're voting for disruptive parties because they're running riot in our estates, our housing schemes with impunity. Almost daring the police to intervene, completely lacking accountability. We're seeing it in classrooms with a level of violence against teachers. So I think there is an issue of how you balance accountability here.
Let me pick up the sentencing point, because this is what outrages quite a lot of people. Now, lawyers will tell you, well, there's a tariff for culpable homicide. Obviously, murder automatically attracts a life sentence with a minimum tariff. Now, I'm somebody who traditionally would regard myself as a bit of a bleeding heart liberal on issues of justice, but I see sentences for culpable homicide. And the other issue, which I used to do stories on television, was death by dangerous driving. And somebody has lost a loved one, and with the current remission regime, some people are out in under 2 years. It just does not seem right, Alison.
Yeah, and first of all, my absolute sympathies to Mr. Rawlinson's wife. I think that's the most tragic kind of set of circumstances. You go to work, you expect to come back from work. You don't expect something like this to happen. But I think we have to remember that the sentencing guidelines are independent of government. It's not for government to decide how long somebody gets jailed for, really.
I accept that. I'll tell you what people may well be saying. And I think I've never come across a politician who's wanted to micromanaging sentencing. That is properly a matter for the judiciary. But the guidelines, of course, can properly be a matter for Parliament if Parliament decides that. And it would appear, and I think that this would be the view of most members of the public, that if I can put it like this, the going rate for culpable homicide and deaths which are a result of dangerous driving are simply too lenient. And, the responsibility of a parliament, in part, is to reflect public concern about what are perceived as being overly lenient sentences.
Yes, and certainly around death by dangerous driving, I would agree with that, because it seems, for many people, the kind of distinction that you're driving a car can be in the wrong hands, at the wrong circumstances, a weapon as well. And the distinction between somebody holding a knife and somebody driving a car at somebody does seem quite bizarre to me in a lot of ways. And there's definitely a strong argument for change there as well. But I do think the complexities of this, it is for the courts to decide at the end of the day what they feel is an appropriate sentence, given the circumstances, given the age, given all of the background to the case.
What I'm saying to you is that
if we start to kind of say that this has to be the sentence,
but that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the guidelines. It does appear to me that, and I read a lot of stuff in the press, that the going rate for culpable homicide is about 5 years. But that appears to be, and I don't have the figures about what everybody that was convicted of culpable homicide, what did they get? But from reading a lot of cases, it seems about 5 years. Now, there's nothing to stop Parliament for saying it should be a minimum of 7. And then you can allow the judiciary to...
I take your point, but I think this young person didn't just go out one day and cause the problem, the crime that ultimately resulted in Mr. Rawlinson's death. I think we need to generally address the wider cultural problem of a rising level of delinquency amongst young people in society in Scotland. And that's something that is a product of defunding a lot of community services, cuts to local government, trying to do, Scandi-style justice policies on an a la carte basis by the government. So it's kind of vibes-based policy without the deep underlying resourcing that you need to actually support young people, particularly in deprived communities, to avoid getting swept up in petty crime, organised crime. Certainly in Glasgow, the interface between care experienced young people, organised crime, drugs is appalling. And police will openly tell you that, and trying to secure convictions is impossible because no one talks to the police.
Well, let me put, if there was a Conservative representative on the panel, and we don't today, but they were asked on, they may well take the point, here's a SNP politician and a Labour politician effectively taking a sort of stage back. And what we really need to do is to be more prescriptive. Alison.
Again, I think it's for the courts to decide these things. Any politician that says, I think this is what exactly should happen, doesn't take into account the circumstances, doesn't take into account the background, doesn't take into account the nuances of the justice system and the circumstances. And I think the Tories are very keen to say that they want to put more people in the jail. They're also not really recognising the fact that we have a system where our jails are overfull. You can't continually say that we want to put more poor people in the jail when the jails don't have room for them.
Okay.
That's the reality of that.
Okay, well, we're out of time this morning, but Paul and Alison, thank you very much for coming in. That's been the Go Radio Politics Show. Coming up, it's the Go Radio Business Show with Lord Willie Haughey and Sir Tom Hunter. But for this edition, that's it from me. So from all of us to all of you, please do have